In 1066, the last great army of the world's most feared warriors vanished from the shores of England. These legendary raiders who had arrived with thousands of ships, how did they simply disappear from the stage of history overnight? Tonight, you'll witness the silent and melancholic end of the great Viking Age. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The autumn mist hung heavy over the Norwegian fjords in the year 1066, clinging to the water like the breath of ancient gods, reluctant to let go. In the harbor of Trondheim, a sight both magnificent and ominous was taking shape. Hundreds of long ships, their dragon heads carved with meticulous care, bobbed gently in the gray waters. These weren't just any vessels, they were the war fleet of Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, and they represented something that no one yet understood. The final chapter of an age that had dominated northern Europe for 3 centuries. Harald stood on the deck of his flagship, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the armada before him. At 51 years old, he was a giant among men, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with iron-gray hair that caught the morning light like spun metal. His blue eyes, sharp as winter ice, held the accumulated wisdom and ruthlessness of a lifetime spent conquering lands from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle. This was a man who had served as captain of the Byzantine Emperor's Varangian Guard, who had fought in Sicily and Bulgaria, who had amassed wealth beyond imagination in the service of Constantinople. Yet, here he was, back in the cold waters of Norway, preparing for what would unknowingly become the Vikings' last great raid. The king wore a mail shirt that had been crafted by the finest smiths in Miklagard, what the Northmen called Constantinople. Its rings caught the weak sunlight, creating patterns of light that danced across his broad chest. At his side hung a sword that had tasted blood on 3 continents, its blade bearing runes that spoke of victory and vengeance. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as dangerous. They held the cold calculation of a man who had never known defeat, who had built his reputation on the broken bodies of those who had dared to stand against him. Around him, the harbor buzzed with activity that spoke of careful planning and enormous ambition. Warriors moved between the ships with the practiced efficiency of men who had spent their lives preparing for war. They carried bundles of spears, their iron points gleaming deadly sharp. Shields painted with the colors of their families and clans were stacked in neat rows. Axes, the preferred weapon of the Viking warrior, hung from belts or were tested for sharpness against whetstones that sang their metallic songs across the water. The ships themselves were marvels of engineering that had evolved over generations. Each longship was a masterpiece of curved oak, built for speed and shallow draft. Their dragon heads, carved with artistic skill that rivaled any cathedral's stonework, seemed to watch over the preparations with ancient wisdom. These vessels had carried Vikings across oceans that others feared to cross, up rivers that seemed impossible to navigate, to shores that had never seen foreign sails. They were more than transportation. They were symbols of a people's relationship with the sea, their confidence in their ability to go anywhere and take whatever they desired. But there was something different about this gathering. Something that spoke of finality even if the participants couldn't recognize it. The men who loaded supplies into the ships were older than those who had sailed on previous raids. Many were fathers now, with wives and children back in the fjords who depended on them. The young firebrands who had once made up the bulk of Viking raiding parties were fewer in number. Time and prosperity had changed the nature of Norse society, though the change was so gradual that most failed to notice it. Harald's own motivation for this expedition was complex, driven by factors that went beyond simple desire for plunder. His claim to the English throne was not entirely without merit. It rested on agreements made between his predecessor Magnus and Edward the Confessor decades earlier. But more than legal right, Harald was driven by the same force that had propelled Vikings for generations: the intoxicating combination of ambition, pride, and the irresistible call of the unknown. He had conquered lands in the south and east, had filled his coffers with Byzantine gold, had earned the respect of emperors and kings, yet the crown of England remained beyond his grasp. And for a man like Harald Hardrada, that made it irresistible. The timing seemed perfect. Edward the Confessor had died without a clear heir, leaving England in a succession crisis that Harald intended to exploit. Harold Godwinson had claimed the throne, but his position was far from secure. William of Normandy was also preparing to press his own claim. Into this chaos, Harold planned to insert himself with devastating force, using the same tactics that had served Vikings for centuries: swift movement, overwhelming violence, and the terror that preceded their reputation. As the final preparations continued through the day, news arrived that would prove fateful. Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own brother, who had been exiled from his earldom of Northumbria, had arrived seeking alliance. Tostig was bitter, angry, and desperate for revenge against the brother, who had failed to support him. He brought with him intimate knowledge of English defenses and a burning desire to see Harold brought low. For Harold, this seemed like a gift from the gods, an ally who knew the enemy's weaknesses and had every reason to fight to the death. The meeting between Harold and Tostig took place in the Great Hall of Trondheim, surrounded by the king's most trusted advisors. Tostig was a smaller man than Harold, but his eyes burned with the same intensity. He spoke of English weaknesses, of the locations where raids would be most effective, of the political divisions that could be exploited. He painted a picture of an England ripe for conquest, divided against itself and vulnerable to the kind of swift, decisive action that Vikings had perfected over generations. But there were voices of caution among Harold's advisors, older men who had seen enough campaigns to recognize the difference between opportunity and disaster. They pointed out that England was no longer the divided, fragmented land that earlier Vikings had terrorized. The English had learned to fight back, had developed their own military systems, had fortified their towns and trained their armies. The age of easy victories through raiding might be coming to an end. Harold listened to these concerns with the patience of an experienced leader. But his mind was already made up. The lure of England was too strong, the potential rewards too great. Besides, he had confidence in his men and in the reputation that preceded them. The very name Viking still struck fear into the hearts of those who heard it. Coastal towns still emptied at the sight of dragon-headed ships. The psychological advantage that had served his people for so long was still intact, or so he believed. As summer turned toward autumn, the final elements of the great expedition came together. The fleet that assembled in Norwegian waters was the largest single Viking force ever gathered. Over 300 ships carrying nearly 10,000 warriors, it represented the military might of not just Norway, but also contingents from Denmark and other Norse territories. These weren't desperate raiders looking for quick plunder, but a professional army intent on conquest and kingdom building. The warriors who filled these ships represented the culmination of Viking military evolution. They were better armed and armored than their predecessors, carrying steel weapons that had been perfected through generations of warfare. Many wore mail shirts that could turn aside all but the most powerful blows. Their shields were reinforced with iron and painted with symbols that declared their allegiance and ancestry. These men had trained for war from childhood, had learned to fight as units rather than individuals, had developed tactics that combined the berserker fury of their ancestors with the discipline of professional soldiers. Yet for all their martial prowess, there was something elegiac about this gathering. Unknown to the participants, They were assembling for the last great Viking raid, the final expression of a culture that had dominated northern seas for 3 centuries. The age of the Viking was ending, not through dramatic collapse, but through gradual transformation. The wild raiders, who had once emerged from nowhere to terrorize coastal settlements, were becoming kings and merchants, Christians and farmers. The very success of Viking expansion had planted the seeds of its own transformation. As Harald's great fleet prepared to depart Norwegian waters, the king himself seemed to sense that this expedition was different from all those that had come before. He had lived long enough to see the world changing around him, to witness the rise of new powers and new ways of warfare. Yet he was too much a product of his time and culture to recognize that he was leading his people into the twilight of their age. To him, this was simply another campaign, another opportunity to prove that Viking warriors remained the masters of Northern Europe. The departure itself was a spectacle that would have impressed observers from any age. 300 dragon ships moving in formation across the dark waters of the North Sea, their square sails billowing with the autumn wind, their crews singing the ancient songs that had accompanied Viking expeditions for generations. The sight was both beautiful and terrible, a display of organized violence that represented the pinnacle of medieval naval power. But as the Norwegian coast faded behind them, Harald and his warriors were sailing toward more than just the shores of England. They were sailing toward the end of their world, toward a battle that would break the back of Viking military power forever. The last great army of the Vikings was heading toward its appointment with history, carrying with it the dreams and ambitions of a people who had shaped the medieval world through the force of their will and the sharpness of their steel. The North Sea stretched before Harald's fleet like a vast gray mirror, reflecting the brooding autumn sky that hung heavy with the promise of storms to come. 300 dragon ships moved across the waters in a formation that spoke of centuries of naval expertise, their hulls cutting through the swells with the practiced efficiency of vessels designed for exactly this purpose. The sight would have been magnificent to any observer. A floating city of warriors carried by the wind toward their destiny, their square-rigged sails emblazoned with the symbols of their clans and kingdom. Harald stood at the prow of his flagship, the Sea Serpent, watching the endless expanse of water that separated Norway from England. The ship beneath his feet was a masterwork of Viking craftsmanship, nearly 90 feet long and built from oak trees that had grown for centuries in the Norwegian forests. Her dragon head, carved by master craftsmen, seemed to sniff the wind for signs of land, while her hull rode the waves with the fluid grace of a living creature. The Sea Serpent had carried Harald on campaigns across the Mediterranean, had weathered storms in the Black Sea, had beached on shores from Sicily to Scotland. She was more than a ship. She was a symbol of his power, his ambition, and his refusal to accept limitation. The king's presence on deck drew the attention of warriors throughout the fleet. Even at 51, Harald Hardrada commanded respect through sheer physical presence. His mailshirt caught the weak sunlight, creating patterns of silver light that danced across his broad chest. The sword at his side had been forged in Constantinople by smiths who served the Byzantine emperor, its blade folded steel that could cut through lesser weapons like parchment. But it was his bearing that truly marked him as a leader. The way he stood against the wind without flinching, the calculating intelligence in his pale blue eyes, the absolute confidence that radiated from every gesture. Around him, the crew of the Sea Serpent went about their duties with the practiced efficiency of professional warriors. These weren't farmers playing at being soldiers, but men who had spent their lives preparing for exactly this kind of expedition. They checked the rigging with hands that knew every rope and block, adjusted the great steering oar with movements that came from years of experience, maintained weapons that had been honed to perfection through constant use. Each man knew his place in the complex hierarchy that governed Viking society, from the lowliest oarsmen to the jarls who commanded their own ships. The fleet moved in a formation that had been perfected through generations of naval warfare. The fastest ships served as scouts, ranging ahead of the main force to watch for enemy vessels or dangerous weather. Behind them came the heavy warships, loaded with the cream of Harald's army, huscarls and professional warriors who had sworn personal loyalty to the king. These ships bristled with weapons and carried the banners that proclaimed the power and ambition of their commander. Bringing up the rear were the supply vessels, broader and heavier than the warships, loaded with food, water, spare weapons, and all the other necessities of campaign life. But it was the psychological atmosphere aboard the ships that truly distinguished this expedition from those that had come before. There was something different in the air. A sense of finality that the warriors themselves couldn't quite identify. Many of the men had families back in Norway, wives and children who depended on their return. The carefree attitudes that had characterized earlier Viking raids were tempered by the responsibilities of middle age. These weren't young men seeking adventure and plunder, but mature warriors embarking on what they hoped would be a final decisive campaign. Olaf the Stout, Harald's closest advisor and battle companion, joined the king at the ship's rail. He was a grizzled veteran of countless campaigns, his face scarred by sword cuts and marked by years of exposure to sun, wind, and salt spray. His beard, once golden, had turned silver, and his hands showed the calluses that came from decades of wielding weapons and hauling on ship's rigging. Yet his eyes remained sharp, and his judgment in matters of war was valued above all others by Harald himself. "The men are eager for battle," Olaf observed, his voice carrying easily over the sound of wind and waves. "But there's something else, something I can't quite name. They're thinking of home more than usual." Harald nodded slowly, understanding exactly what his advisor meant. The nature of Viking society had been changing gradually for decades, though the change was so subtle that most failed to recognize it. The wild raiders who had burst out of Scandinavia in the 8th century had evolved into something more complex. Kings and earls who ruled established territories, merchants who traded across vast distances, farmers who worked land their grandfathers had conquered. The very success of Viking expansion had begun to transform the culture that had created it. "They're older," Harald replied, his voice thoughtful. "Most of these men have responsibilities that our fathers never knew. They're not sailing for adventure alone. They're sailing to secure their children's futures." This change was visible throughout the fleet in ways both subtle and obvious. The ships themselves were more sophisticated than those of earlier generations, built with techniques learned from contact with other maritime cultures. The warriors carried better weapons and armor, products of improved metalworking skills and trade connections that spanned continents. Even their tactics had evolved, incorporating lessons learned from fighting alongside and against the professional armies of Byzantium, France, and England. But perhaps most significantly, many of these warriors were Christians now, or at least nominally so. The old gods, Odin, Thor, Frey, still commanded respect and ritual observance, but Christ had gained a foothold in Viking society that would have been unthinkable to earlier generations. This religious transformation was part of a broader cultural shift that was gradually integrating Scandinavian society into the mainstream of medieval European civilization. As the fleet made its way across the North Sea, the rhythm of shipboard life settled into patterns that had been established over centuries of seafaring. The day began before dawn with the changing of the watch, as fresh men took over the duties of navigation and sail handling from their exhausted comrades. The ships carried no lights after dark, relying instead on the skill of their navigators to maintain course and avoid collision. Star knowledge passed down through generations allowed the fleet to maintain its heading, even when clouds obscured the sky. Food aboard the ships was simple but adequate for the short crossing to England. The warriors subsisted on dried fish, hard bread and ale, supplemented by whatever provisions they had brought from home. Water was precious and carefully rationed, stored in barrels that had been sealed with pitch to prevent contamination. Each ship carried enough supplies for several days at sea, though the crossing to England was expected to take no more than 3 days under favorable conditions. The weather, however, was beginning to show signs of the autumn storms that made North Sea crossings treacherous. The wind, which had been favorable when they left Norway, began to shift and strengthen, forcing the fleet to adjust course to maintain their heading toward the English coast. Waves that had been manageable in the morning grew larger as the day progressed, sending spray across the decks and requiring constant attention to the steering oars. For men accustomed to such conditions, the roughening sea was merely an inconvenience, rather than a serious threat. Viking ships had been designed specifically for the challenging waters of northern Europe, with shallow drafts that allowed them to beach on any coastline and flexible construction that could flex with the waves rather than fighting them. The crews knew their vessels intimately, understanding exactly how much stress the rigging could take, and how to adjust sail to maintain maximum speed while avoiding damage. But as the fleet pressed eastward toward England, other concerns began to occupy the thoughts of commanders and common warriors alike. Intelligence about English defenses was limited and contradictory. Some reports suggested that Harald Godwinson was fully prepared for invasion, with armies positioned to respond quickly to any landing. Others indicated that the English king was distracted by the threat from William of Normandy in the south, leaving the north vulnerable to attack. Tostig Godwinson, Harold's English ally, moved between the ships in a small boat, consulting with various commanders about landing sites and tactical options. His knowledge of English geography and politics was invaluable, but his bitter anger toward his brother Harold made some of the Norwegian leaders uneasy. Men driven by personal revenge were useful allies, but they could also be unpredictable when their own interests conflicted with broader strategic goals. The former Earl of Northumbria painted a picture of northern England that was both encouraging and sobering. The region was wealthy, with prosperous towns and fertile farmland that would provide rich plunder for successful raiders. But it was also well defended with fortified positions that could serve as strong points for English resistance. The local population had experience dealing with Scottish raids and would not be easily intimidated by foreign invaders. As night fell on the second day of the crossing, the fleet found itself scattered across miles of dark water. Navigation and formation was difficult under the best of circumstances, and the deteriorating weather had forced the ships to spread out to avoid collisions. Signal fires were impossible in the wind and rain, so each vessel had to rely on its own navigation skills to maintain the proper heading toward England. Harold spent the long night hours on deck, despite the protests of his advisors who urged him to seek shelter below. The responsibility of command weighed heavily on him during these dark hours as he contemplated the magnitude of what he was attempting. This wasn't just another raid for plunder and glory. It was a bid to establish himself as king of one of Europe's most powerful nations. Success would make him one of the most influential rulers of his age. Failure could mean the destruction of everything he had spent his life building. The king's thoughts turned to the broader implications of his expedition. Viking society was at a crossroads, though few recognized it yet. The old ways of raiding and conquest were becoming more difficult as their targets grew stronger and more organized. The future belonged to rulers who could adapt to changing circumstances, who could build stable kingdoms rather than simply terrorizing their neighbors. England represented the ultimate prize in this new game, a wealthy, unified nation that could serve as the foundation for a northern empire. But Harold was also aware that he was playing against formidable opponents. Harald Godwinson was an experienced military commander who had proven his skill in campaigns against the Welsh and Scots. William of Normandy was a ruthless political operator who commanded one of the most effective military organizations in Europe. Both men had legitimate claims to the English throne and armies capable of defending those claims. The coming campaign would test not just Viking military prowess, but the ability of their entire culture to compete in a changing world. Dawn of the third day brought clearer skies and the first glimpse of the English coast. The chalky cliffs of Yorkshire rose from the sea like a wall, their white faces catching the morning light in a display that was both beautiful and ominous. For many of the warriors, this was their first sight of England, and they gazed at the distant shore with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. This was the land they had come to conquer, the prize that would justify the risks they had taken in following Harald across the North Sea. The fleet began to reform as individual ships spotted the coast and adjusted their courses toward the predetermined landing sites. The careful planning that had gone into the expedition now began to show its value, as ship after ship found its assigned position in the formation that would carry them to shore. The months of preparation, the careful selection of landing beaches, the coordination with Tostig's local knowledge, all of it was coming together as the great armada approached English water. Harald stood at the prow of the Sea Serpent, watching the coast grow larger with each passing hour. The mail on his chest caught the morning light, and the wind whipped his graying hair around his weathered face. Behind him, the largest Viking fleet in history spread across the water, like a migrating flock of deadly birds. The dragon heads on the ships seemed to strain forward eagerly, as if sensing the blood that would soon be spilled on English soil. Yet even in this moment of approaching triumph, there was something melancholic about the scene. Unknown to Harald and his warriors, they were sailing toward the end of an age. The last great Viking army was approaching its appointment with destiny, carrying with it the dreams and ambitions of a culture that had shaped the medieval world. But they were also sailing towards Stamford Bridge, toward a battle that would break the back of Viking military power forever and mark the end of the age of the Northmen. The morning mist clung to the river house, like the breath of sleeping gods, as Harald's fleet made its way inland from the Humber estuary. 300 dragon ships moved in perfect formation up the winding waterway, their shallow drafts allowing them to navigate channels that would have grounded deeper vessels. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. A floating army penetrating deep into the heart of Yorkshire, carrying with it the accumulated military might of the Norse world. Harald stood at the prow of the Sea Serpent, his keen eyes scanning the riverbanks for signs of English resistance. The countryside that stretched away on either side was green and prosperous, dotted with villages and farmsteads that spoke of centuries of peaceful development. Smoke rose from cooking fires and blacksmith forges. Cattle grazed in meadows that had never known the hoofbeats of foreign horses, and the church bells that rang in the distance carried a tranquil certainty that was about to be shattered forever. The king's weathered hands gripped the ship's rail as he contemplated the landscape that would soon become a battlefield. At 51, Harald Hardrada had seen enough campaigns to recognize the signs of a land unprepared for war. The English had grown soft during decades of relative peace, their defenses oriented more toward the threat of Scottish raids in the north than the possibility of a full-scale invasion from across the sea. This was exactly the kind of situation that Viking commanders had learned to exploit, a wealthy, complacent target ripe for the taking. Behind Harald, the deck of the Sea Serpent bustled with the quiet efficiency of professional warriors preparing for battle. Weapons were checked and sharpened for the 100th time. Mail shirts were adjusted to ensure perfect fit, and shields were positioned within easy reach of their owners. These men had fought alongside their king in the sun-baked hills of Sicily and the frozen plains of Russia. They had learned their trade in the service of the Byzantine emperor, where discipline and tactical precision meant the difference between victory and death. They were no longer the wild berserkers of earlier generations, but professional soldiers who combined the fierce courage of their ancestors with the tactical sophistication of experienced campaigners. Olaf, The stout moved among the warriors with the easy authority of a man who had earned his position through decades of loyal service. His scarred face showed no emotion as he inspected weapons and equipment, but his experienced eye caught every detail that might mean the difference between victory and defeat. The leather on a shield grip that had worked loose, the slight bend in a spear shaft that could cause it to break at a crucial moment, the nervous tension in a young warrior who had never faced English steel. Nothing escaped his attention. "The men are ready," Olaf reported to Harald, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a veteran who had seen too many battles to be impressed by easy ones. "But they're curious about the enemy. Most have never fought English housecarls. They've heard the stories, but stories aren't the same as facing steel." Harald nodded slowly, understanding the concern that lay behind his advisor's words. The English housecarls, the professional warriors who formed the backbone of Anglo-Saxon armies, had earned a formidable reputation throughout northern Europe. These weren't militia farmers who could be scattered by a fierce charge, but full-time soldiers who trained constantly and fought with weapons and armor that rivaled anything the Vikings could field. A wise commander never underestimated such opponents, regardless of his own army's reputation. The fleet continued its stately progress up the River Ouse, passing villages whose inhabitants had begun to realize that something unprecedented was happening. Children pointed excitedly at the dragon ships from the safety of their mothers' arms, while men with weapons began to gather in small groups along the riverbanks. But there was no organized resistance, no coordinated attempt to stop the invasion before it could establish itself on English soil. The English had been caught completely unprepared for an attack of this magnitude. Tostig Godwinson moved between the ships in a small boat, consulting with Harald and his other commanders about landing sites and tactical dispositions. The former Earl of Northumbria was in his element now, his intimate knowledge of Yorkshire geography proving invaluable as the fleet navigated the complex network of rivers and tributaries that fed into the Humber. His face showed a mixture of satisfaction and bitter anticipation. Satisfaction at the smooth progress of the invasion, anticipation of the revenge he would soon exact on the brother who had failed to support him. "There," Tostig called out, pointing toward a stretch of riverbank that offered easy access to firm ground. "That's where we beach the ships. The ground beyond is perfect for forming battle lines, and the roads lead directly toward York." Harald studied the indicated landing site with the practiced eye of a commander who had conducted amphibious operations on 3 continents. The bank was gently sloped, with solid ground that would allow his warriors to form up quickly after landing. More importantly, it offered multiple routes of advance toward the regional capital of York, preventing the English from predicting exactly where the main attack would come. It was, he decided, as good a place as any to begin the conquest of England. The beaching of 300 Viking ships was a spectacle that would have impressed observers from any age. The dragon heads were turned toward shore like hunting hounds scenting prey, while the crews used oars and poles to maneuver their vessels into perfect positions along the bank. The operation was carried out with the precision of a military drill, each ship finding its assigned place in a formation that had been planned months in advance. Within hours, nearly 10,000 Viking warriors had disembarked and begun forming into the battle array that would carry them toward York. Harald himself was among the first to step onto English soil, his mail shirt catching the afternoon sunlight as he strode up the riverbank. The sword at his side had tasted blood on 3 continents, and the iron spear in his right hand bore runes that spoke of victory in battle. But it was his bearing that truly marked him as a leader, the absolute confidence that radiated from every gesture, the calculating intelligence in his pale blue eyes, the physical presence that commanded attention even among warriors who were themselves giants among men. The army that assembled on the Yorkshire plain was a magnificent sight that represented the pinnacle of Viking military evolution. At its core stood the huscarls, professional warriors who had sworn personal loyalty to Harald and who formed the elite striking force of his army. These men wore mail shirts that had been crafted by the finest smiths in Scandinavia, carried shields that bore the personal devices of their king, and wielded weapons that had been honed to perfection through constant use. They were organized into units based on ships' crews, maintaining the bonds of loyalty and mutual dependence that had been forged during long voyages and shared dangers. Around the huscarls were arranged the bounty free farmers and craftsmen who owed military service to their lords. These men were less heavily armed and armored than the professionals, but they were far from the militia rabble that some enemies assumed them to be. Most had seen action in local conflicts or cattle raids, and all had trained with weapons from childhood. They carried spears and axes with the familiarity of men who used such tools in their daily lives, and their shields bore the colors and devices of the districts they represented. The formation that took shape on the English plain followed patterns that had been refined through centuries of Viking warfare. The center was held by the huscarls, formed into a wedge that could smash through enemy lines like a spear point. On either flank were positioned the bondi, whose job was to prevent enemy forces from outflanking the main attack. Behind the front line stood reserves of fresh warriors, ready to exploit any breakthrough or to shore up any section of the line that came under pressure. But it was the psychological impact of the Viking army that truly set it apart from other military forces of the age. These warriors carried with them the accumulated reputation of 3 centuries of successful raiding and conquest. The very sight of their dragon ship banners and raven standards was enough to strike fear into enemies who had grown up hearing stories of Viking ferocity. The war songs they sang as they advanced spoke of glorious death in battle and eternal feasting in Valhalla. Even those who had converted to Christianity retained enough of the old beliefs to face death without flinching. Word of the Viking landing spread across Yorkshire with the speed of wildfire, carried by refugees fleeing the path of the advancing army. The message that reached York was simple and terrifying. The largest Viking force in living memory had landed on English soil and was marching toward the regional capital with unstoppable momentum. The local English commanders faced a choice that no military leader ever wants to confront: fight against overwhelming odds or abandon the most important city in northern England without a battle. Earl Morcar of Northumbria and his brother Earl Edwin of Mercia were brave men who had proven their courage in previous campaigns against Welsh raiders and Scottish incursions. But they were also practical soldiers who understood the difference between heroic gestures and military necessity. The force at their disposal consisted mainly of the local ford, militia farmers who were more accustomed to defending their own villages than fighting pitched battles against professional armies. Against Harold's 10,000 veterans, their few hundred housecarls and 1,000 militia stood little chance of victory. Yet honor and duty demanded that they make the attempt. York was too important to abandon without a fight, and the political consequences of fleeing before foreign invaders would be devastating to their reputations and positions. More importantly, every hour they could delay Harold's advance was an hour that might allow King Harold Godwinson to march north with the main English army. If they could hold the Vikings long enough, the invasion might yet be crushed between the hammer of the royal army and the anvil of Yorkshire's fortifications. The English army that assembled near the village of Fulford was a force that exemplified both the strengths and weaknesses of Anglo-Saxon military organization. At its core stood perhaps 200 housecarls, professional warriors whose equipment and training rivaled anything the Vikings could field. These men wore mail shirts that had been inherited from fathers and grandfathers, carried swords that bore names and histories stretching back generations, and fought with the grim determination of men defending their homes and families. Around the housecarls were arranged nearly 1,000 members of the local fard, farmers and craftsmen who had been called up for military service according to ancient legal obligations. These men varied widely in their equipment and experience, Some carried fine weapons and wore mail shirts that marked them as prosperous landowners, while others made do with simple spears and leather jerkins. But all shared a common determination to defend their homeland against foreign invasion. And their knowledge of local terrain gave them advantages that no amount of foreign gold could buy. The battlefield itself was a stretch of marshy ground near the village of Fulford, where the river Ouse meandered through water meadows that were crisscrossed with drainage ditches and patches of boggy soil. The English commanders had chosen their position carefully, placing their army where the difficult terrain would neutralize some of the Vikings' advantages in mobility and numbers. If Harald wanted to reach York, he would have to fight his way across ground that favored defenders who knew every hidden obstacle and treacherous footing. Earl Morcar positioned his forces with the skill of an experienced commander, who understood both the strengths of his army and the nature of the threat it faced. The housecarls formed the center of his line, positioned on the firmest ground where their superior equipment and training could be used to maximum effect. The Ford were spread along the flanks, taking advantage of ditches and hedgerows that would break up Viking charges and create opportunities for individual acts of heroism. But as the morning mist began to lift from the battlefield, revealing the full extent of Harald's army deploying across the opposite ridge, even the most optimistic English observers began to understand the magnitude of the task they faced. The Viking force was not just larger than their own, it was qualitatively different, a professional army that moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The sight of 10,000 warriors forming into battle array was enough to make even veteran soldiers question their chances of survival. Harald himself rode along the front of his army on a magnificent stallion that had been a gift from the Byzantine emperor, his presence serving to inspire his own warriors while intimidating his enemies. The mail shirt he wore had been crafted by smiths who served in the great armories of Constantinople, and the sword at his side bore runes that spoke of victories won in the service of emperors and kings. But it was his bearing that truly marked him as dangerous. The absolute confidence of a man who had never known defeat, the calculating intelligence that could spot enemy weaknesses in an instant. The battle itself began with the traditional exchange of challenges and boasts that preceded most medieval engagements. Harald sent forward a skald, a warrior poet, whose job was to compose verses that would inspire his comrades and demoralize his enemies. The songs that echoed across the battlefield spoke of the glorious deeds of the Vikings' ancestors, of the ravens that would feast on English flesh, of the golden halls of Valhalla that awaited warriors who died with weapons in their hands. The English response was more prosaic, but no less determined. Earl Morcar himself rode forward to address his men, speaking in the plain language of farmers and craftsmen rather than the flowery phrases of court poets. He reminded them that they were fighting for their homes and families, that every yard of ground they yielded brought foreign invaders closer to their wives and children. His words carried the weight of simple truth, and they were answered by a roar of defiance that echoed across the water meadows. When the battle finally began, it started with the methodical advance of Harald's army. Across the difficult terrain that separated the two forces, the Vikings moved forward in perfect formation, their shields locked together in the famous shield wall that had broken enemy armies from Ireland to Constantinople. The sound of their advance was like distant thunder, the rhythmic tramp of thousands of feet, the clatter of weapons against shields, the war songs that grew louder as they approached the English line. The first clash came when the Viking advance reached the network of drainage ditches that crisscrossed the battlefield. Here the English had positioned groups of Fard armed with long spears, hoping to break up the enemy formation and create opportunities for the housecarls to exploit. For a few moments it seemed as if the tactic might succeed. Viking warriors stumbled in the boggy ground, their perfect formation began to fragment, and English spears found gaps in mail shirts that had been exposed by the difficult footing. But Harald's army was composed of veterans who had faced every kind of tactical challenge that medieval warfare could offer. The warriors in the front ranks adapted quickly to the difficult terrain, using their shields to bridge narrow ditches and their weapons to clear obstacles that blocked their path. More importantly, the reserves behind them moved forward to exploit every gap in the English line, turning local advantages into broader tactical success. The breakthrough came when Harald himself led his Huscarls in a devastating charge against the English center. The king fought like a man possessed, his great spear dealing death with every thrust, his presence inspiring his warriors to feats of heroism that broke the back of English resistance. Earl Morcar himself fell during this assault, struck down by a Viking axe as he tried to rally his Huscarls for one last stand. With their commander dead and their line broken, the English army began to disintegrate. The rout that followed was swift and merciless. English warriors who had fought bravely as long as their formation held together found themselves scattered and isolated, easy prey for Viking pursuers who showed no mercy to men who had dared to stand against them. The water meadows around Fulford became a killing ground where English blood soaked into soil that had known peace for generations. Yet, even in victory, there was something ominous about the battle's aftermath. The English had fought more fiercely than Harald had expected, and his own casualties were heavier than he would have preferred for the opening engagement of a campaign. More importantly, the delay at Fulford had given King Harald Godwinson precious time to organize his response to the invasion. Unknown to the celebrating Vikings, the English king was already marching north with the main royal army, moving with a speed that would have surprised commanders who thought they knew the limits of medieval military mobility. As night fell over the battlefield at Fulford, Harold's victorious army celebrated their triumph with the traditional feasting and drinking that followed successful engagements. The warriors sang songs of their own prowess and composed new verses about the cowardice of their enemies. Gold and silver taken from English bodies was distributed according to ancient custom, and plans were made for the march on York that would complete the conquest of northern England. But there were thoughtful men in Harold's army who looked beyond the immediate euphoria of victory to consider the broader implications of what they had accomplished. The English had fought well despite being outnumbered and outclassed, showing a determination that suggested future battles would be neither easy nor cheap. More troubling still was the speed with which local forces had been mobilized to meet the invasion. It suggested a level of military organization that would make the conquest of England a far more difficult proposition than anyone had anticipated. As Harald himself walked among his warriors, accepting their congratulations and distributing rewards for exceptional bravery, his thoughts were already turning toward the challenges that lay ahead. Fulford had been a victory, but it was only the first step in a campaign that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of Viking civilization itself. The easy part was over. Now came the real test: whether his army could maintain its momentum in the face of English resistance that was certain to grow stronger with each passing day. The morning of September 25th, 1066, dawned clear and warm over the Yorkshire countryside, with the kind of golden autumn light that transforms even the most ordinary landscape into something magical. Near the village of Stamford Bridge, where an ancient stone crossing spanned the River Darnant, Harald Hardrada's victorious army was enjoying what they believed would be a routine day of negotiation and tribute collection. The Vikings had scattered across the meadows on both sides of the river, their weapons stacked carelessly, their mail shirts removed to better enjoy the unseasonably warm weather. It was a scene of casual confidence that spoke of warriors who believed their reputation alone was sufficient to cow any remaining English resistance. Harald himself stood on the eastern bank of the Derwent, watching as groups of his men splashed in the shallow water or dozed in the warm sunshine. At 51, the king had seen enough campaigns to appreciate moments of peace between battles, and this morning felt like a gift from the gods themselves. The victory at Fulford had broken English resistance in Yorkshire. York had surrendered without a siege, And now local English leaders were coming to offer hostages and tribute in the traditional manner of defeated enemies. It seemed as if the conquest of northern England was proceeding exactly according to plan. The Norwegian king wore only a simple tunic and trousers on this warm morning, his famous mail shirt hanging from a tree branch nearby. His great sword rested against a boulder, its rune-carved blade catching occasional glints of sunlight. Even relaxed and informal, Harald commanded attention through sheer physical presence. Nearly 7 feet tall, with iron-gray hair and pale blue eyes that missed nothing of what occurred around him. His weathered hands, scarred by decades of warfare, gestured easily as he discussed the day's proceedings with his advisors. Olaf the Stout, Harald's most trusted counselor, seemed less at ease than his king despite the apparent security of their position. The grizzled veteran had survived too many campaigns to ever feel completely safe in enemy territory. And something about the morning's arrangements troubled his professional instincts. The English delegates who were supposed to arrive for the formal surrender were late, and the scattered disposition of the Viking army made him nervous despite the warm weather that made wearing armor uncomfortable. "Something feels wrong," Olaf muttered. His scarred face creased with concern as he studied the empty road that led toward York. The English should have been here hours ago. Either they're planning something, or something has happened to prevent their coming. Harald followed his advisor's gaze toward the distant horizon, where heat haze was beginning to shimmer above the rolling hills. The king's expression remained calm, but his eyes showed the calculating intelligence that had made him one of the most successful military commanders of his generation. He had learned during his years in Byzantine service never to ignore the instincts of experienced soldiers, and Olaf's concerns deserved serious consideration. "Perhaps they're simply afraid," Harald replied, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe his own words. "The massacre at Fulford may have convinced them that resistance is futile. Fear can make men late for their own surrender." But even as he spoke, Harald was mentally reviewing the dispositions of his army and considering what adjustments might be necessary if the situation deteriorated. The Vikings were spread across several miles of countryside, with roughly half the army on each side of the River Durrant. Those on the western bank, where the main camp had been established, were closer to their weapons and equipment. But nearly 5,000 warriors were scattered across the eastern meadows, many of them far from their arms and armor. If an attack came suddenly, it would take precious time to organize an effective response. The army that lounged in the Yorkshire sunshine represented the finest military force that Scandinavia had ever assembled. These weren't the wild raiders of earlier generations, but professional warriors who had been shaped by decades of service in the most advanced military organizations of the medieval world. Many had fought in the service of the Byzantine emperor, where they had learned tactics and discipline that rivaled anything the Roman legions had achieved. Others had campaigned in France, Ireland, and Scotland, gaining experience against every type of enemy that Northern Europe could produce. Yet, for all their skill and experience, the Vikings were displaying a casual attitude toward security that would have horrified their ancestors. Weapons lay scattered across the meadows where they had been carelessly discarded. Mail shirts hung from tree branches like drying laundry, and many warriors were swimming in the river or dozing in the warm sunshine. The easy victory at Fulford had bred a confidence that bordered on complacency, and the warm weather had made the discomfort of wearing armor seem unnecessary. To Stig Godwinson moved among the scattered groups of warriors, his status as Harald's English ally giving him authority to coordinate the various contingents that made up the invasion force. The former Earl of Northumbria was dressed in fine English clothing rather than Norse war gear, a deliberate choice meant to emphasize his role as a legitimate claimant to power rather than a foreign adventurer. His face showed satisfaction at the progress of the campaign, but also an underlying tension that suggested he understood better than most how precarious their situation really was. "The men are confident," Telstig reported to Harald. his voice carrying across the clear morning air. Perhaps too confident. They speak as if the conquest of England is already complete, as if Harald Godwinson will simply surrender rather than fight for his crown. Harald nodded thoughtfully, understanding the concern behind his allies' words. Overconfidence had destroyed more armies than cowardice ever had, and the Vikings' casual attitude toward security was beginning to worry him despite the apparent lack of immediate threat. An experienced commander learned to trust his instincts, and something about the morning's arrangements was beginning to feel wrong in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The missing English delegates were only part of the problem. Intelligence about enemy movements had been sketchy since the landing, with reports filtered through local sources whose reliability was questionable at best. The assumption that Harald Godwinson was still in the south dealing with the threat from William of Normandy was based more on wishful thinking than solid information. If the English king had moved faster than anticipated, if he had already begun marching north with the main royal army, then the scattered Viking forces around Stamford Bridge could find themselves in serious trouble. As the morning wore on, the heat continued to build, creating a drowsy atmosphere that made thoughts of battle seem increasingly remote. Warriors who had spent the night celebrating their victory at Fulford were content to rest in the shade, many of them still suffering from the effects of captured English ale. The songs they sang spoke of triumph and plunder, of the easy conquest that lay ahead, of the golden halls of York that would soon be theirs to rule. It was the soundtrack of an army that believed its enemies were already beaten. But on the western horizon, beyond the rolling hills that hid them from Viking scouts, events were unfolding that would transform this peaceful morning into one of the most decisive battles in English history. Harald Godwinson, King of England, was approaching with the main royal army, moving with a speed that would have been considered impossible by military theorists of the age. The English king had force-marched his troops from the south, covering distances that should have taken weeks in a matter of days, driven by a determination to crush the Viking invasion before it could establish itself permanently on English soil. The English army that was converging on Stamford Bridge represented the military might of a kingdom that had been forged in the crucible of Danish invasions and Welsh raids. At its core marched the royal housecarls, professional warriors whose skill and equipment rivaled anything that Scandinavia could produce. These men had sworn personal loyalty to Harald Godwinson, and they would die before they saw him defeated by foreign invaders. Their weapons were the finest that English smiths could produce. Their armor was tested in countless skirmishes along the troubled borders, and their discipline was legendary, even among enemies who respected few things about Anglo-Saxon military organization. Behind the housecarls came the select fide, men chosen from the local militias for their exceptional skill and courage. These weren't farmer soldiers pressed into reluctant service, but warriors who had volunteered for the dangerous honor of fighting alongside the king's own guards. They carried weapons that had been inherited from fathers and grandfathers, bore shields that displayed the colors of their home counties, and marched with the grim determination of men defending their homeland against foreign conquest. Harald Godwinson himself rode at the head of this formidable force, his presence serving to inspire his own troops while demonstrating his personal commitment to the campaign. The English king was a man in the prime of life, 44 years old and hardened by years of warfare against Welsh princes and Scottish raiders. His reputation for military skill was matched only by his political cunning, and his determination to defend his crown was absolute. He had already proven his ability to move armies with unprecedented speed, and now he was about to demonstrate that English warriors could fight with a ferocity that matched anything the Vikings could bring to bear. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came when a lone horseman appeared on the road from York, riding hard toward the Viking positions at Stamford Bridge. The messenger's horse was lathered with sweat, and his face showed the strain of a man who had ridden through the night with news that could not wait for morning. As he approached the scattered groups of Vikings, warriors began to gather around him, sensing that his message would change everything about their comfortable morning. "Harald Godwinson comes." The messenger gasped, his words carrying across the meadows like a thunderclap. "The English king marches with his full army. They will be here within the hour." The effect of this announcement was immediate and dramatic. Warriors who had been lounging in the sunshine suddenly scrambled for their weapons. Mail shirts were hastily donned despite the heat, and commanders began shouting orders to men who were scattered across miles of countryside. The casual confidence of the morning evaporated in moments, replaced by the urgent activity of an army that had suddenly realized it was about to fight for its life. Harald himself felt the cold touch of recognition as the messenger's words sank in. This was the nightmare scenario that every competent commander planned for but hoped never to face. Being caught unprepared by an enemy who had moved faster and more decisively than anyone thought possible. The Vikings were scattered, many without their armor, with their forces divided by the river Durant. If Harald Godwinson attacked immediately, the results could be catastrophic. But Harald Hardrada had not earned his reputation by panicking in the face of adversity. Even as his mind raced through the tactical challenges that lay ahead, he began issuing the orders that might yet save his army from disaster. Messengers were dispatched to recall the warriors scattered across the eastern meadows. Trumpets sounded the call to arms, and the great raven banner of Norway was raised to serve as a rallying point for men who needed to find their units in the chaos of hasty preparation. "Form the shield wall on the ridge above the bridge," Harald commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded armies on 3 continents. "We cannot wait for all our men to return, but we can hold the high ground until they do. Send riders to bring back those who are furthest away. Tell them to come armed and ready for immediate battle." The position Harald had chosen was strong but desperate. The ridge overlooked the bridge crossing, giving his hastily assembled forces the advantage of height, while forcing any English attack to come uphill against prepared positions. But with only half his army immediately available, and many of those without their full equipment, the Vikings would be fighting at a severe disadvantage against an enemy whose numbers and preparation remained unknown. As the Viking army struggled to organize itself for battle, the sound of approaching drums began to echo across the Yorkshire countryside. The rhythmic beating grew steadily louder, accompanied by the tramp of thousands of feet and the jingling of mail shirts worn by warriors who had marched through the night to reach this battlefield. The English army was approaching with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche, and there was no longer any question about their intentions. Harald strapped on his mail shirt despite the heat, the familiar weight of the Byzantine-crafted armor, bringing a measure of comfort even in this desperate situation. His great sword hung at his side, its rune-carved blade bearing the accumulated luck of a lifetime's victories. The iron spear in his right hand had been a gift from the Emperor of Constantinople, and its point had never failed to find enemy flesh when battle was joined. If this was to be his last fight, he would meet it with the weapons that had made him famous across the medieval world. The shield wall that formed on the ridge above Stamford Bridge was a magnificent sight, despite the circumstances of its creation. Veteran warriors who had fought from Ireland to Constantinople locked their shields together in the formation that had broken enemy armies for centuries. Their weapons caught the morning light in patterns that spoke of disciplined violence, and their war songs echoed across the valley with defiant courage. These men had followed Harald across the known world, and they would follow him into death itself if necessary. But even as the Vikings prepared for battle, both armies understood that something unprecedented was about to occur. This wasn't just another raid or border skirmish. but a clash between two of the most formidable military forces in Northern Europe. The outcome would determine not just who ruled England, but whether the age of Viking expansion would continue or come to a bloody end on the banks of the River Derwent. As the English army crested the hill overlooking Stamford Bridge, the true magnitude of Harald's challenge became apparent. Harald Godwinson had brought not just his household troops, but a substantial portion of the English military establishment. Thousands of housecarls and select ford filled the valley below, their weapons and banners creating a sea of steel and colored cloth that stretched as far as the eye could see. This wasn't the local militia that had fought at Fulford, but the military might of a unified kingdom determined to expel foreign invaders. The battle that was about to begin would mark the end of the Viking Age, not through gradual decline, but through a single, catastrophic defeat that would shatter Norse military power forever. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, was about to fight his final battle against an enemy who represented everything that the changing medieval world was becoming: organized, disciplined, and utterly determined to resist the old ways of raiding and conquest. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the blood-soaked ridge above Stamford Bridge, where the greatest Viking army ever assembled was dying in the Yorkshire heat. What had begun as a confident morning of expected tribute and submission had transformed into a nightmare of shattered shields and broken dreams. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, lay still among his fallen huscarls, his magnificent frame pierced by an English arrow that had found the gap between his mail shirt and helmet. The sight of their fallen leader sent shockwaves through the Norse ranks that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. The death of Harald marked more than just the fall of a single warrior. It represented the symbolic end of an age that had shaped Northern Europe for 3 centuries. The king who had conquered lands from Sicily to Scotland, who had served emperors and commanded the respect of kings, had fallen to an anonymous English archer whose name would never be recorded in the sagas. There was something profoundly fitting about this end. The individualistic hero culture of the Vikings brought low by the disciplined mass tactics of a more organized age. Olaf the Stout stood over his fallen king's body, his own mail shirt torn and bloodied, his scarred face grim with the knowledge of what Harald's death meant for the army and the campaign. Around him, the surviving huscarls fought with the desperate fury of men who knew their world was ending. These veterans of countless campaigns had followed Harald across the known world, had shared in his triumphs and treasures, had sworn oaths of loyalty that bound them even unto death. Now those oaths were being tested in the most brutal way possible. "Form square around the king," Olaf roared, his voice carrying over the clash of steel and the screams of wounded men. "Let no English dog defile his body." But even as the surviving huscarls attempted to create a defensive formation around Harald's corpse, the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. The English attack had shattered the Viking shield wall in multiple places, creating gaps that Harald Godwinson's housecarls were exploiting with ruthless efficiency. The ridge that had seemed like such a strong defensive position was becoming a trap, with English forces threatening to surround the scattered groups of Norse warriors who were still trying to organize coherent resistance. The battle itself had unfolded with a speed and violence that had caught even experienced warriors off guard. Harald Godwinson's assault had begun with a devastating arrow barrage that had torn gaps in the Viking line before the two armies even came to grips. The English king had learned from the mistakes made at Fulford, where Earl Morcar had allowed the Vikings to close to hand combat on relatively equal terms. This time, the longbows of the English fyrd had exacted a terrible toll before the real fighting even began. When the English charge finally came, it struck the weakened Viking line with the force of a thunderbolt. Harald Godwinson himself led the assault, his royal banner flying above a wedge of housecarls, whose discipline and equipment rivaled anything the Norse could field. These weren't the militia farmers who had been scattered at Fulford, but professional warriors fighting for their homes and king. Their weapons were sharp, their armor was tested, and their determination was absolute. The moment when Harald fell had been the turning point of the entire battle. The Norwegian king had been fighting in the front rank, as was his custom, when an English arrow found its mark with deadly precision. The sight of their invincible leader toppling backward, his great spear falling from nerveless fingers, had sent a shock through the Viking army that was worse than any tactical defeat. For men who believed in the personal charisma and divine favor of their leaders, Harald's death was not just a military disaster, but a spiritual catastrophe. Tostig Godwinson, Harald's English ally, had died earlier in the battle, struck down by housecarls who showed no mercy to a man they considered a traitor to his own people. His body lay trampled in the mud near the bridge itself, his fine clothes torn and bloodied, his dreams of revenge against his brother transformed into a meaningless corpse among hundreds of others. The civil war that had brought him to Harald's side had ended not in triumph but in ignominious death on foreign soil. Now, as the afternoon wore on, the surviving Vikings found themselves facing a choice that no warrior wanted to confront: die uselessly in a hopeless fight, or abandon their fallen comrades and flee toward whatever safety they could find. The decision was made easier by the arrival of Eystein Ori, Harald's son, who had finally reached the battlefield with the warriors who had been left to guard the ships. These fresh troops, running hard from the coast in full armor, arrived too late to change the outcome, but in time to witness the magnitude of the disaster. Eystein himself was a young man in his 20s, tall like his father but lacking Harald's accumulated wisdom and battlefield experience. He had inherited his father's courage but not his judgment, and his arrival on the battlefield was marked more by desperate fury than tactical skill. The reinforcements he brought were welcome, but they were also exhausted from their forced march and arrived piecemeal rather than in the coordinated formation that might have made a difference. "The king is dead," Eystein gasped as he reached the remnants of the Norwegian army. "Long live the king. Rally to me, and we will avenge him." But even as the young prince attempted to assume command, it was clear to experienced observers that the battle was already lost beyond recovery. The English had not only numerical superiority but also the devastating psychological advantage that came from having killed the enemy leader. Harald Godwinson's forces were pressing their attack with relentless efficiency, methodically destroying isolated groups of Vikings who could no longer coordinate their resistance. The retreat, when it finally began, was a masterpiece of organized chaos. Olaf the Stout, despite his own wounds, took charge of the withdrawal with the skill of a veteran who had seen too many battles to panic even in disaster. His first priority was getting the surviving Norwegian nobles away from the battlefield before they could be killed or captured. These men represented the political leadership of the invasion, and their loss would make any future operations impossible. "Fall back by companies," Olaf commanded, his voice hoarse from shouting over the din of battle. "The first line holds while the second withdraws, then the second covers the first. No man runs until he's told to run." The discipline that had made the Viking army so formidable now served them well in defeat. Despite the shock of Harald's death and the obvious hopelessness of their situation, the surviving warriors maintained enough cohesion to conduct a fighting withdrawal rather than a panicked rout. Companies of huscarls formed rearguard actions that bought time for their comrades to escape, selling their lives dearly to ensure that some remnant of the great army might survive to tell the tale. But the English pursuit was relentless and well organized. Harald Godwinson had no intention of allowing significant numbers of Vikings to escape and potentially return with reinforcements. His housecarls pressed the retreat with systematic violence, cutting down stragglers and preventing the formation of any defensive lines that might slow their advance. The king himself rode among his troops, encouraging them to show no mercy to invaders who had come to steal his crown. The bridge at Stamford became a particular focal point of carnage as fleeing Vikings attempted to cross the River Derwent. While being harried by English pursuers, the narrow stone crossing became clogged with desperate men, and English archers on the surrounding hills turned the approach into a killing ground. Bodies piled up in the shallow water, and the river itself began to run red with Norwegian blood. According to legend, a single Viking warrior made a heroic last stand on the bridge itself, holding off the entire English army with nothing but an axe and his own defiant courage. Whether this story is true or merely the kind of tale that grows around great battles, it captures something essential about the nature of Viking resistance in those final hours. Even in defeat, even facing certain death, these warriors maintained the fierce individual courage that had made them legendary throughout the medieval world. The withdrawal toward the coast was a running battle that lasted well into the evening. Groups of Vikings would attempt to form defensive positions on favorable ground, only to be outflanked or overwhelmed by English forces that seemed to appear from every direction. The countryside that had seemed so peaceful that morning was now filled with armed men hunting down the remnants of what had been the most formidable military force in northern Europe. Many of the Vikings never made it back to their ships. Some were cut down during the retreat. Others collapsed from exhaustion in the Yorkshire heat. Still others were captured by English forces who showed varying degrees of mercy depending on their mood and the circumstances of surrender. The survivors who did reach the coast found a fleet that had been reduced from 300 proud dragon ships to fewer than 30 vessels capable of making the return voyage to Norway. The ships themselves told the story of the disaster more eloquently than any saga. Where once 300 dragonheads had faced the sea with proud defiance, now only scattered vessels remained, many of them damaged, most undermanned, all bearing the weight of survivors who had lost everything they had come to win. The holds that should have been filled with English gold contained instead wounded men and broken dreams. Eystein Ori, now the nominal leader of what remained of the Norwegian forces, faced the grim task of organizing the evacuation of his father's shattered army. The young prince was wounded himself, bearing a sword cut on his left arm that would leave him scarred for life, and his face showed the shock of a man who had witnessed the destruction of everything he had been raised to believe was invincible. The decision of what to do with Harald's body became a matter of both practical and symbolic importance. The king's corpse represented not just the remains of a beloved leader, but the embodiment of Norse royal dignity and the physical proof of the expedition's failure. Some argued for taking the body back to Norway for proper burial. Others suggested that Harald should be interred on English soil, where he had chosen to make his final stand. In the end, practical considerations overcame sentiment. The surviving ships were overcrowded with wounded men, and the risk of English pursuit made speed more important than ceremony. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, was buried in a shallow grave on the Yorkshire coast, marked only by a simple stone cairn that would weather away within a few generations. The man who had dreamed of ruling England from the Thames to the Scottish border would rest forever in foreign soil, his ambitions buried with his bones. The loading of the ships was a process that spoke eloquently of the magnitude of the disaster. Where 300 vessels had disgorged nearly 10,000 warriors just days before, fewer than 30 ships now struggled to accommodate the pitiful remnants of that mighty host. Men who had sailed to England as conquerors now huddled in overcrowded hulls as refugees, their weapons lost, their armor abandoned, their dreams of glory transformed into nightmares of survival. The voyage home was a trial that tested the survivors' endurance as severely as the battle itself had tested their courage. The ships were overloaded and undermanned, making navigation difficult and dangerous. Storms that would have been minor inconveniences for properly crewed vessels became life-threatening emergencies for ships operating with skeleton crews. Some vessels were lost during the crossing, taking their passengers down to join the countless other Vikings who had found their graves beneath the North Sea's gray waters. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the return journey was the psychological burden carried by the survivors. These men had been part of the greatest Viking expedition in history, had sailed forth with the confidence of conquerors, had believed themselves to be writing a new chapter in the saga of Norse expansion. Instead, they were returning home as the broken remnants of a dream that had died on English soil, carrying news that would shatter the confidence of an entire civilization. The news of the disaster at Stamford Bridge spread across Scandinavia with the speed of wildfire, carried by survivors who struggled to explain how the invincible Harald Hardrada and his mighty army had been destroyed by an enemy they had considered inferior. The reports seemed almost impossible to believe. How could the finest warriors in the world have been so decisively defeated? How could a king who had never known defeat have fallen to English arrow? How could an army that had conquered from Sicily to Scotland have been destroyed in a single afternoon? But as more survivors reached home and their stories were compared and confirmed, the truth became inescapable. The age of easy Viking victories was over. The targets of Norse raids had learned to fight back with weapons and tactics that matched or exceeded anything Scandinavia could produce. The world had changed, and the Vikings had failed to change with it quickly enough to avoid catastrophe. The political consequences of Harald's death and the destruction of his army were immediate and far-reaching. Norway itself was thrown into chaos as various claimants struggled for control of a kingdom that had lost its military elite and much of its accumulated wealth. The careful balance of power that Harald had maintained through personal charisma and military success collapsed overnight, leaving behind a vacuum that would take years to fill. More broadly, the defeat at Stamford Bridge marked the end of the Viking Age as a period of aggressive expansion and raiding. The culture that had produced Harald Hardrada and his warriors would continue to exist, but it would be forced to adapt to a world where strength alone was no longer sufficient for success. The future belonged to kingdoms that could organize their resources efficiently, not to individual heroes who relied on personal courage and charismatic leadership. As the few surviving ships made their way across the North Sea toward home, their passengers carried with them more than just the news of defeat. They carried the end of an age, the death of a dream, and the burden of explaining to their people how the world had changed while they weren't looking. The last voyage of the Vikings was ending not in triumph but in tragedy, not in conquest but in catastrophe, not in glory but in the grim recognition that their time was over. The gray waters of the Norwegian fjords had never seemed so cold or unwelcoming as they did to the handful of dragon ships that limped home from England in the autumn of where 300 proud vessels had departed with the flower of Norse manhood. Fewer than 24 returned, their hulls scarred by battle and their crews bearing wounds that would never fully heal. The sight of these battered survivors struggling toward familiar harbors carried a message that no amount of royal propaganda could disguise. The age of Viking supremacy was over, ended not by gradual decline but by catastrophic defeat on English soil. In the great hall of Trondheim, where Harald Hardrada had once held court with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat, the news of Stamford Bridge fell like a thunderbolt among the assembled nobles and warriors. The messenger who brought the tidings was Olaf the Stout, Harald's most trusted advisor, his scarred face bearing fresh wounds and his eyes holding the hollow look of a man who had witnessed the end of his world. The silence that greeted his words was more profound than any amount of wailing or lamentation could have been. "The king is dead," Olaf announced, his voice carrying across the hall with the finality of a funeral bell. Harald Hardrada, son of Sigurd, king of Norway, fell at Stamford Bridge with the flower of our army around him. The English have proven that Viking steel is not invincible, and our age of easy conquest is finished. The political earthquake that followed this announcement would reshape not just Norway but the entire Scandinavian world. Harald's death left behind no clear successor capable of uniting the fractious Norwegian nobility, and the destruction of the royal army meant that whoever did eventually claim the crown would have little military power to enforce their authority. The careful balance of forces that had made the great expedition possible was shattered, leaving behind a power vacuum that would take generations to fill. Magnus Haraldsson, Harald's surviving son, found himself thrust into a position he was ill-equipped to handle. Still in his 20s, and lacking his father's accumulated prestige and political skill, Magnus faced the impossible task of rebuilding Norwegian royal power from the wreckage of Stamford Bridge. The young king inherited a crown, but not the military force necessary to wear it with confidence, and his reign would be marked by constant struggles against nobles who saw weakness and opportunity in equal measure. But the consequences of Harald's defeat extended far beyond the immediate political chaos in Norway. Across Scandinavia, the news of Stamford Bridge forced a fundamental re-evaluation of Norse military capabilities and strategic assumptions. For 3 centuries, Viking raiders had enjoyed technological and tactical advantages that made their expeditions profitable enterprises with relatively low risks. The English victory demonstrated that these advantages were no longer decisive, and that future raids would face organized resistance that could inflict devastating casualties on attacking forces. The economic implications were equally severe. Viking expeditions had not been mere adventures undertaken for personal glory, but carefully calculated business ventures that brought enormous wealth back to Scandinavian kingdoms. The gold and silver that flowed from successful raids had funded the construction of ships, the maintenance of professional armies, and the complex political relationships that held Norse society together. Without this external source of wealth, Scandinavian rulers would be forced to find new ways of financing their ambitions and maintaining their power. The transformation was already visible in the attitudes of the surviving warriors who had returned from England. These men, who had once been eager for new expeditions and fresh conquests, now spoke of the dangers they had witnessed and the strength of English resistance. Their stories, repeated in halls and taverns across Scandinavia, painted a picture of an enemy that was no longer weak and divided but unified, well-armed and utterly determined to resist foreign invasion. The psychological impact of these accounts was perhaps more devastating than the military defeat itself. Christianity, which had been making gradual inroads into Scandinavian society for decades, suddenly found its message of peace and spiritual salvation more appealing to populations that were beginning to question the wisdom of constant warfare. The old gods, Odin, Thor, Frey, had promised victory to brave warriors who died with weapons in their hands. But those promises had proved false at Stamford Bridge, where the finest Norse warriors had fallen despite their courage and skill. Perhaps, many began to think, it was time to listen to the priests, who spoke of a different kind of eternal reward. The shift away from raiding culture was most evident in the changing priorities of Scandinavian rulers. Kings who had once measured their success by the number of foreign expeditions they could mount now focused their attention on domestic concerns, improving agriculture, encouraging trade, building churches, and establishing more stable forms of government. The wealth that had once flowed from Viking raids would have to be replaced by the patient work of farming, craftsmanship, and peaceful commerce. This transformation was perhaps most visible in Denmark, where King Svein Estridsson, Harald's former ally and rival, made the calculated decision to abandon plans for further English expeditions. Svein had originally intended to follow up Harald's invasion with his own assault on England, but the news from Stamford Bridge convinced him that such adventures were no longer profitable. Instead, he turned his attention to consolidating Danish control over the Baltic trade routes, recognizing that the future lay in commerce rather than conquest. The end of the Viking Age was not, however, a sudden transformation that occurred overnight. The cultural and economic changes that followed Stamford Bridge took place over decades and generations. As Scandinavian society gradually adapted to a world where military superiority could no longer be taken for granted. The process was neither smooth nor uniform, with different regions and social groups adjusting at different rates to the new realities of medieval politics. In Iceland, the remote island that had been settled by Viking colonists, the news of Harald's defeat was received with a mixture of shock and philosophical resignation. The Icelandic sagas, which would preserve the memory of the Viking Age for future generations, began to take on a more elegiac tone, as their composers recognized that they were chronicling the end of an era. The stories of Harald Hardrada and other great Viking leaders became part of a literary tradition that celebrated a heroic past, while acknowledging that such heroes could no longer succeed in a changed world. The transformation of Viking culture was perhaps most evident in the evolution of their ships and seafaring technology. The dragon ships that had carried Harald to his doom at Stamford Bridge represented the pinnacle of Norse naval architecture, designed specifically for raids and rapid coastal assaults. But as the focus of Scandinavian activity shifted from raiding to trade, shipbuilders began to develop different types of vessels. Broader, more stable craft designed to carry cargo rather than warriors, equipped for long-distance commerce rather than hit-and-run attacks. The trading networks that replaced Viking raiding expeditions were in many ways more sophisticated and profitable than the military adventures they superseded. Norse merchants established permanent settlements along the rivers of Russia, built trading posts in Greenland and Iceland, and developed commercial relationships that stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. These peaceful endeavors required different skills than those that had made Vikings feared throughout Europe, but they also offered more sustainable prosperity than the boom and bust cycle of successful and unsuccessful raids. The role of women in Norse society also began to change, as the culture shifted away from its warrior origins. Viking women had always held positions of respect and authority, but the constant absence of men on raiding expeditions had given them even greater prominence in managing domestic affairs and maintaining family properties. As men began to stay home more often, focusing on farming and trade rather than foreign adventures, the gender dynamics of Scandinavian society evolved in ways that would have long-term consequences for the development of medieval European civilization. The legal systems of Scandinavian countries also underwent significant changes as rulers sought to establish more stable and predictable forms of governance. The thing assemblies that had traditionally governed Norse communities began to develop more sophisticated legal codes, influenced by contact with Christian European traditions, but maintaining distinctively Scandinavian characteristics. These legal innovations reflected the broader transformation of Viking society, from a warrior culture to a more settled and agricultural civilization. Perhaps the most poignant symbol of the changing times was the fate of the dragon ships themselves. These magnificent vessels, which had once been the terror of European coastlines, began to rot in harbors across Scandinavia as their owners found more profitable uses for their time and resources. Some were converted into cargo vessels, their dragon heads removed and their hulls modified for peaceful trade. Others were simply abandoned, their carved prows eventually collapsing into the waters that had once carried them to victory and glory. The religious transformation of Scandinavia accelerated dramatically in the decades following Stamford Bridge. The old Norse gods who had promised victory to brave warriors seemed to have abandoned their followers when they needed divine assistance most. Christian missionaries who had been making slow progress for generations suddenly found receptive audiences among populations that were ready to embrace a religion that promised different rewards than military success. Churches began to replace pagan temples, and the complex mythology that had sustained Viking culture for centuries gradually gave way to Christian theology. The integration of Scandinavia into the broader European political system was another consequence of the end of Viking raiding. As Norse kingdoms abandoned their aggressive expansionism, They became more acceptable partners for diplomatic and commercial relationships with other European powers. Marriages between Scandinavian royalty and the ruling families of England, France, and Germany became more common, creating political alliances that would have been impossible during the height of the Viking Age. The memory of Harald Hardrada and his final expedition became a touchstone for later generations of Scandinavians who struggled to understand how their ancestors' seemingly invincible military machine had been so decisively defeated. The sagas that commemorated his life and death portrayed him as a tragic hero whose greatness was undermined by the changing nature of the world around him. These stories served both to preserve the memory of Viking achievements and to explain why such achievements were no longer possible in a changed world. The economic prosperity that eventually replaced Viking raiding proved to be more sustainable and broadly beneficial than the wealth that had flowed from military expeditions. Trade networks established by Norse merchants created lasting relationships between Scandinavia and other parts of Europe. Relationships that survived political changes and military conflicts. The skills that had made Vikings effective raiders, seamanship, courage, adaptability, proved equally valuable in peaceful commerce, and many former warriors found profitable careers as merchants and explorers. The educational and cultural developments that accompanied the Christianization of Scandinavia also marked a decisive break with the Viking past. The establishment of schools and monasteries brought literacy to populations that had previously relied on oral tradition to preserve their history and culture. The runic writing system that had served Norse society for centuries began to give way to Latin script, and the intellectual horizons of Scandinavian civilization expanded to include the broader tradition of European learning. The transformation was not without its critics and resistance. Many Norse nobles and warriors found it difficult to abandon the values and practices that had brought their ancestors glory and wealth. Some continued to dream of reviving the great expeditions, and occasional raids continued to occur well into the medieval period. But these later adventures lacked the scale and significance of earlier Viking expeditions, and they gradually diminished in frequency and importance as Scandinavian society completed its transition to a more settled and peaceful way of life. The ultimate irony of the Viking Age's end was that its conclusion was brought about not by weakness or decline, but by the very success of Viking expansion and settlement. The Norsemen had been so effective at establishing themselves throughout northern Europe that they had inadvertently taught their enemies how to resist future attacks. The kingdoms that had once been helpless before Viking raids had learned to organize effective defense, and the cultural exchange that had resulted from centuries of Norse settlement had spread military and technological knowledge that eliminated many of the advantages that had made Viking expeditions profitable. As the 11th century drew to a close, the world that had produced Harald Hardrada and his generation of warrior kings was disappearing, replaced by a more stable and organized medieval European civilization. The age of heroes, who could carve out kingdoms with nothing but their courage and their swords, was ending, superseded by an era that valued different qualities: administrative skill, diplomatic finesse, economic productivity, and spiritual devotion. The Vikings had helped to create this new world through their own expansion and settlement, but they could not survive as Vikings within the civilization they had helped to build. In the centuries that followed the catastrophe at Stamford Bridge, the memory of Harald Hardrada and his final expedition underwent a remarkable transformation. What had begun as a crushing military defeat gradually evolved into something far more complex and enduring. A legend that would capture the imagination of poets, historians, and dreamers long after the last dragon ship had rotted away in forgotten harbors. The man who had died with an English arrow in his chest became larger in death than he had ever been in life, his story serving as both an epitaph for the Viking Age and a bridge connecting the heroic past with the more prosaic realities of medieval European civilization. The first accounts of Harald's life and death were preserved in the oral traditions of Icelandic skalds, warrior poets, who had accompanied the great king on his expeditions and witnessed firsthand the glory and tragedy of his final campaign. These men, survivors of Stamford Bridge, who had somehow escaped the slaughter and made their way back to Scandinavia, carried with them memories that burned like brands in their minds. Around winter fires in distant halls, they began to compose the verses that would eventually become the foundation of the great sagas, transforming raw experience into the polished gold of heroic literature. Snorri Sturluson, writing in Iceland more than a century after Harald's death, captured something essential about the king's character when he described him as the thunderbolt of the north, a man whose very presence on a battlefield could change the course of history. But Snorri was also honest enough to acknowledge that Harald's greatest weakness was his inability to recognize that the world had changed around him. The tactics and strategies that had brought him victory in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea proved inadequate against an English enemy that had learned from centuries of Viking raids how to organize effective resistance. The Heimskringla, Snorri's great collection of royal sagas, presented Harald as a tragic figure whose personal magnificence was ultimately undermined by historical forces beyond his control. This portrayal would influence how later generations understood not just Harald himself but the entire Viking Age that he represented. The sagas depicted the Norsemen as heroes worthy of admiration and respect, but also as men whose time had passed, whose values and methods were no longer adequate for success in a changing world. But the literary transformation of Harald's memory was only one aspect of how his legacy evolved over time. More immediately practical was the way his defeat influenced the strategic thinking of medieval European rulers who faced the continuing challenge of defending their territories against foreign invasion. The tactics that Harald Godwinson had used at Stamford Bridge, rapid mobilization, concentrated force, decisive assault, became a model for how organized kingdoms could respond to sudden military threats. The English victory demonstrated that even the most formidable enemies could be defeated if they were met with sufficient preparation and determination. The political consequences of Harald's defeat continued to reverberate throughout Scandinavia. For generations after his death, the destruction of Norway's military elite at Stamford Bridge created a power vacuum that was filled only gradually and incompletely by rulers who lacked Harald's personal charisma and accumulated prestige. Magnus Haraldsson, Harald's son and successor, spent most of his reign struggling to maintain royal authority against nobles who sensed weakness and opportunity in the wake of the English disaster. The civil wars that periodically convulsed Norway during the late 11th and early 12th centuries can be traced directly to the political instability that followed Harald's death. Denmark, under King Svein Estridsson, managed to avoid some of the worst consequences of the post-Stamford Bridge chaos by abandoning plans for further English expeditions and focusing instead on consolidating control over Baltic trade routes. Svein's pragmatic response to the changing strategic situation demonstrated that Scandinavian rulers could adapt successfully to the new realities of medieval politics, but only by abandoning the aggressive expansionism that had defined the Viking Age. The Denmark that emerged from this transformation was more prosperous and stable than its predecessor, but it was also fundamentally different in character and ambition. The economic transformation of Scandinavia in the wake of the Viking Age's end was perhaps even more significant than the political changes. The wealth that had once flowed from successful raids and conquests had to be replaced by other sources of prosperity, and Norse societies proved remarkably adaptable in developing new forms of economic activity. Trade networks that had originally been established to support military expeditions evolved into permanent commercial relationships that brought steady prosperity rather than the boom and bust cycle of raiding culture. The development of Baltic commerce was particularly important in this transformation. Norse merchants, drawing on the seafaring skills and geographical knowledge that had made their ancestors such effective raiders, established trading routes that connected Scandinavia with the growing commercial centers of northern Germany and the Low Countries. These peaceful merchants, carrying cargoes of furs, amber, and timber rather than swords and axes, represented the evolution of Viking culture into something that could thrive in the more settled world of the high medieval period. The religious transformation of Scandinavia also accelerated in the decades following Stamford Bridge, as Christianity completed its conquest of populations that had once worshipped Odin and Thor. The old Norse gods who had promised victory to brave warriors seemed to have abandoned their followers when they needed divine assistance most. Christian missionaries found receptive audiences among people who were ready to embrace a religion that offered different rewards than military success and conquest. The construction of stone churches throughout Scandinavia during the 11th and 12th centuries marked a visible symbol of this religious transformation. These buildings, often built on sites that had previously held pagan temples, represented not just a change in religious practice, but a fundamental shift in cultural values and priorities. The God of the Christians demanded different virtues than the Norse gods had valued: humility rather than pride, peace rather than warfare, spiritual contemplation rather than physical courage. Yet, the process of Christianization was not simply a matter of replacing one set of beliefs with another. Norse Christianity developed its own distinctive characteristics influenced by the cultural traditions and social structures that had shaped Scandinavian society for centuries. The warrior saints who became popular in medieval Scandinavia, figures like Saint Olaf of Norway, represented a synthesis of Christian and Norse values that allowed for a gradual transition rather than an abrupt cultural revolution. The legal and social changes that accompanied the end of the Viking Age were equally significant. The thing assemblies that had traditionally governed Norse communities began to develop more sophisticated legal codes, influenced by contact with continental European traditions but maintaining distinctively Scandinavian characteristics. These legal innovations reflected the broader transformation of Viking society from a warrior culture to a more settled and agricultural civilization that required different forms of social organization. The role of women in Norse society also evolved as the culture shifted away from its warrior origins. Viking women had always held positions of respect and authority, but the constant absence of men on raiding expeditions had given them even greater prominence in managing domestic affairs and maintaining family properties. As men began to stay home more often, the gender dynamics of Scandinavian society changed in ways that would influence the development of medieval European civilization. The fate of the dragon ships themselves became a powerful metaphor for the broader transformation of Norse culture. These magnificent vessels, which had once carried Harald and his warriors across the North Sea to their appointment with destiny, began to rot in harbors across Scandinavia as their owners found more profitable uses for their time and resources. Some were converted into cargo vessels, their dragon heads removed and their military fittings replaced with equipment for peaceful trade. Others were simply abandoned, their carved prows eventually collapsing into the waters that had once carried them to victory and glory. The archaeological evidence of this transformation is still visible today in the ship burials and harbor sites scattered throughout Scandinavia. The contrast between the magnificent military vessels buried with earlier Viking leaders and the more utilitarian craft found in later contexts tells the story of a culture in transition, adapting to new realities while struggling to maintain connections with its heroic past. The literary legacy of the Viking Age, preserved in the Icelandic sagas and other medieval texts, served a crucial function in helping Scandinavian societies come to terms with their transformed circumstances. These years allowed later generations to maintain pride in their ancestors' achievements, while acknowledging that such achievements were no longer possible or desirable in a changed world. The sagas celebrated Viking courage and skill while also serving as cautionary tales about the dangers of excessive ambition and the importance of adapting to changing circumstances. The figure of Harald Hardrada himself became a central symbol in this literary tradition, representing both the glory and the tragedy of the Viking Age. Later saga writers portrayed him as a man of extraordinary ability and ambition whose very greatness became his downfall. His story served as a meditation on the themes of fate, heroism, and the relationship between individual will and historical necessity that would become central to medieval Scandinavian literature. The influence of these stories extended far beyond Scandinavia itself. Medieval European literature, as a whole, was enriched by the narrative traditions that emerged from the Viking Age, and the figure of the Norse warrior became a stock character in the cultural imagination of medieval Europe. The romantic image of the Viking that developed during this period, brave, independent, loyal to his comrades, would eventually evolve into the stereotypes that still influence popular perceptions of Norse culture today. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Harald Hardrada and his final expedition was the way their story illuminated the broader historical processes that were transforming medieval Europe during the 11th century. The defeat at Stamford Bridge was not an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern of change that was replacing the fragmented, warrior-dominated societies of the early medieval period with the more centralized and institutionalized kingdoms of the High Medieval era. The Norman conquest of England, which followed just weeks after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, represented another aspect of this transformation. William of Normandy succeeded where Harold had failed, not because he was a better warrior, but because he brought to bear the resources and organizational capabilities of a more sophisticated political system. The Normans represented the future of medieval warfare. Disciplined, well-equipped professional armies, commanded by rulers who understood the importance of logistics, intelligence, and political preparation. In many ways, Harald Hardrada and William of Normandy represented two different approaches to the same challenge: how to establish and maintain political power in an increasingly competitive medieval environment. Harald relied on the traditional Viking methods of personal charisma, military prowess, and the loyalty of warrior followers. William combined these traditional elements with newer forms of organization and administration that proved more effective in the long run. The contrast between these two men and their different fates suggests something important about the nature of historical change during the medieval period. Success no longer belonged to individual heroes, however magnificent, but to rulers who could mobilize the resources of entire societies in pursuit of their goals. The age of Achilles was giving way to the age of organization, and Harald's defeat marked the moment when this transition became irreversible. Yet for all the practical advantages of the new medieval order, there remained something magnificent about Harald and his doomed expedition that continued to capture the imagination of later generations. The image of the last great Viking king, standing tall among his fallen warriors on the ridge above Stamford Bridge, became a powerful symbol of heroic resistance to the forces of change and modernization. Even those who recognized the necessity of the transformation mourned what was lost when the dragon ships sailed away for the last time. This romantic nostalgia for the Viking Age would eventually give rise to a vast literature of historical fiction, scholarly investigation, and popular entertainment that continues to flourish today. The figure of Harald Hardrada has appeared in countless novels, films, and television programs, usually portrayed as a tragic hero whose personal magnificence was undermined by historical forces beyond his control. These modern interpretations often say more about contemporary attitudes toward heroism and individual achievement than they do about medieval realities. But they testify to the enduring power of Harald's story to speak to universal human concerns. The archaeological rediscovery of Viking culture during the 19th and 20th centuries added new dimensions to the legend of Harald and his warriors. The excavation of ship burials, the decipherment of runic inscriptions, and the systematic study of medieval Scandinavian settlements revealed the sophisticated and complex civilization that had produced the dragon ships and their crews. These discoveries helped to dispel some of the cruder stereotypes about Viking brutality, while confirming the essential accuracy of many of the literary sources that had preserved their memory. Modern scholarship has also placed Harald's expedition in its proper historical context, showing how it represented both the culmination and the end of a particular phase in medieval European development. The Vikings were not simply barbarian raiders, but participants in the complex process of cultural exchange and political development that was transforming Northern Europe during the early medieval period. Their ultimate failure to establish lasting political control over England reflected not their own inadequacies, but the success of their enemies in adapting to and surpassing the methods that had made Viking expansion possible. Perhaps the most fitting memorial to Harald Hardrada and his warriors is the simple fact that their story continues to be told more than 1,000 years after their deaths. In an age that has seen the rise and fall of countless empires and the transformation of human civilization beyond anything medieval minds could have imagined, the tale of the last Viking king and his final voyage retains its power to move and inspire. The dragon ships may have rotted away in forgotten harbors, but the memory of their final journey across the North Sea toward destiny and disaster lives on in the collective imagination of humanity. The grey waters off the Yorkshire coast, where Harald's dreams of conquest died with an English arrow in his chest, have witnessed many other tragedies and triumphs in the centuries since Stamford Bridge. But few events in the long history of that turbulent region carry the symbolic weight of that September day in 1066, when the last great Viking army met its doom and an age of heroes came to its end. The waves that carried the survivors home to Norway also carried with them the conclusion of one of history's most remarkable chapters, leaving behind only memory, legend, and the eternal human fascination with those who dare greatly and fail magnificently.